We are continuing our chapter on the Middle Ages. Today's topic is going to be England and France. The Angles and the Saxons are going to attack Britain in the 400s. By the time we get to the late 800s, the Vikings are going to try to attack. King Alfred of Wessex united the Angles and the Saxons to fight the Vikings. This united force defeated the Vikings, and the united group became known as the Anglo-Saxons. The territory that they controlled became known as Angleland, which has been translated into England. King Alfred ruled England from 871 to 899. He founded schools, hired scholars to rewrite Latin books in the Anglo-Saxon language. The Anglo-Saxon language is Old English. Old English can be seen on this slide right here in this picture. It should look very familiar because it's English, just sort of fancier. The actual font itself is still used a lot today for sports fans. That D is the D of the Detroit Tigers. And you may see a lot of tattoos tend to feature some Old English font as well. But many weak rulers would follow King Alfred. Vikings are going to conquer western France around the year 900, and that region became known as Normandy. William is going to become the leader here in the mid-1000s. William was a descendant of the Viking that conquered Normandy, and he also happened to be the cousin of King Edward of England. When Edward died, a noble named Harold Godwinson became the King of England. William believed that he had rights to the throne because he was related. So in 1066, William and his army of knights sailed to England. William would meet Harold in the Battle of Hastings. Basically, the winner of this battle would become the King of England. There were 10,000 Normans versus 7,000 Englishmen. So even though the battle was being fought in England, the Normans had more men because Harold had just defeated two of his other rivals, including his own brother, and he lost a lot of his men in those battles. So he was a little bit weaker because of all these battles that they had been fighting. Because of this, William and his men were able to win, so the Normans win, and they kill Harold in the process. William was crowned king and became known as William the Conqueror. So now William is the King of England, and he's the head of Normandy as well. So William wants to know all about his new kingdom, so he takes a census. William had never even been to England before this, so he needs to learn a little bit about this new territory that he's now the king of. This would be the first census done in Europe since the Romans. It's known as the Domesday Book. It counted basically all of the people, the animals, and then the acreage or the farms in England at that time, and all of that information was kept in this book. The Normans and the Anglo-Saxons would combine their customs. Some spoke French, others spoke English. As the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons married, they merged to form a new culture. John will become the King of England in 1199. He immediately raises taxes and punished enemies without a trial. So if he didn't like you, he would just have you put in prison because he could. He took advantage of his power, and he did what he pleased. Some examples. John put a man in prison just so he could take his horse and cart. We're talking about the King of England, who essentially has access to everything, put a person in jail to take his horse and cart, even though he could have any horse and cart that he wanted. He also was suspected of killing his own nephew, and he would make promises in return for money, but then he just wouldn't keep his promises. So the nobles and the knights are going to join forces. They meet John, and they say that he needs to sign a document or face a rebellion. The document was the Magna Carta, or Great Charter. John was backed into a corner, and he was forced to sign. The knights are his army. They are there to protect him. But they're saying that if he doesn't sign this, that they're basically coming after him. So he really didn't have a choice. The Magna Carta is going to limit the king's power. It says that he could not collect taxes without approval, and that everyone was entitled to a fair trial. There's a variety of other things as well, but those are just two highlights of the Magna Carta. King Edward I in the 1200s will call for a meeting. He's going to create a new group in England called the Parliament. This was the first step toward a representative government. The Parliament still exists today. The Parliament building can be seen in this picture on this slide. You might recognize the clock tower to the right. That's Big Ben. Big Ben is one of the more famous landmarks, not only in England, but in the world. This is the Parliament building. So when you see Big Ben, that is where like their government works in England. At first, Parliament had 2 knights from every county, 2 people from every town, and all of the high-ranking officials. This was to ensure that each area was properly represented. Parliament was divided into 2 houses. This should sound somewhat familiar, hopefully. The House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Lords were the high-ranking nobles and church officials. The House of Commons were the knights and the townspeople. Parliament in England today still has the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So there's not a whole lot that has changed since this time period. But again, this should hopefully sound somewhat familiar because the United States has a very similar setup with our legislative branch with the Senate and the House of Representatives. France, by 843, Charlemagne's empire was divided into 3 separate areas. The westernmost portion of this became the Kingdom of France. So this map is kind of small here, but you can see that like the orange section over here is Normandy. England is also orange because remember, William had conquered both and took control here. France is just going to be this yellowish like gold section right here. So it's pretty small at this time. So the kings go to war with England to take over parts of Normandy. They thought it was silly that England would control Normandy when they were separated by a body of water. They believed it made more sense for the French to control this territory. The French kings gained more land and therefore more power. So if you look at this map now, you can see that France expanded over into Normandy. And even though it's not quite the size that it is today, it's very, very close. Philip IV, or Philip the Fair, ruled from 1285 to 1302. He met with 3 different classes in France: the clergy, the nobles, and the townspeople, and that is going to be France's first step toward a representative government as well. So we're starting to see this big transition from the feudal territories and the feudal societies into these representative governments throughout Europe that look much more similar to the type of government that exists in Europe today and exists in the United States today as well. That is the end of the slides for England and France.